Welcome everyone. Welcome to the State of AI in Pharma. My name is Patricia Elise and I'm here with Ai4 to bring you this awesome event. Just a quick housekeeping item before we get started. Please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box instead of the chat because it's much easier for us to keep your questions organized there and we want to make sure that we answer them. So please make sure that you're using the Q&A feature to ask questions throughout the event. So now I'd like to welcome our panelists to the virtual stage. And I'd like to hand it over to Sandeep, who will be moderating this session. Thanks so much and enjoy.
All right, thanks, Patricia. So thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Sandeep. I lead the real world evidence strategy, partnerships, and operations in Pfizer's newly established Real World Center of Excellence. Today I've got three distinguished esteemed AI experts in the field, and I'm really excited about getting today's conversation started. I'll be the panel moderator for today. So to kick things off, let's go into introductions with each of the members that we have on the panel today. So I'm going to start with Tatiana first, and we can meet the other.
Thank you, Sandeep, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel. Love to talk about the state of AI in pharma and hear from different companies and different use cases. My name is Tatiana. I am a solutions director for data science and artificial intelligence at Novartis. So just a quick orientation. There are many data science teams at Novartis. So we're 100,000 people organizations, and we have about 1,000 data scientists at Novartis. Or people who touch data and who make sense of it. Our team, DSAI, is basically working across the entire product portfolio and the pipeline. So all the way from drug discovery to clinical trials to manufacturing to commercial units. And we partner with the data scientists across the pipeline to identify the business opportunities that could benefit from AI technologies. And we conceptualize the solutions and deliver them with the impact to the business. I consider myself a data science generalist. So I have more commercial background just because my previous roles were in commercial, but in my current role, I'm more of a generalist. So I know a little bit about a lot when it comes to subject matter expert in AI and data science. Thank you.
Great, and let's do Jason next.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Jason. I'm a principal at Analytical Wizards. Our tagline is we're revolutionizing healthcare analytics, really focusing on the data science and AI ML algorithms, as well as our technology play. We have two platforms that allow us to do that more efficiently and effectively. But before Analytical Wizards, I was also at Novartis. And before that, I was at Bayer, AZI, and started off at ZS Associates. But my background was actually in engineering. But glad to be here and glad to see some familiar faces.
And then last but not least, Faisal.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. Similar to Novartis and I'd say other companies, there's many teams of data scientists. I sit within our central team. We're set up as a hub and spoke within R&D at AstraZeneca. I lead a team of AI, data scientists, machine learning experts working on all sorts of problems throughout the drug development lifecycle, from early stage discovery through phase 3 trials, and then a little bit beyond. But my remit doesn't cover manufacturing and commercial activities. My team of data scientists includes folks with a genomics, bioinformatics background, working on imaging, devices, wearable devices, as well as real-world evidence, machine learning for trial simulations, trial outcomes, and operations. So runs the gamut. And I've had the privilege of working within pharma, within diagnostics, as well as payers across academia, industry, and startups. So have been able to leverage a number of different perspectives. And a pleasure to be here today.
Awesome. So if we can put up the PowerPoint presentation. All right, we'll get started with the questions now. So this is teeing it up to kind of dive deep into it. So where is AI making the biggest impact across your organizations? What opportunities are created through AI? And so Tatiana, I'll start with you on this one, if you don't mind, and then we'll go across the panel here.
Of course, there's lots of opportunities, and pharma and life science industry is really has been ripe for disruption for a number of years. And it's not just because of the use cases and the technologies that are out there. We all know data science is not a new concept. It's really because we've become much more digital, and the data that we have and the technologies that we have that are capable of collecting data that could be analyzed is really vast. And digitizing pharma is really a big lift that we're able to largely overcome in the last 3 to 5 years. So I see huge opportunities in 3 areas of, and I'm sure there are more, but there are 3 main areas of life science. First is, of course, drug discovery. So if you think about the era of the blockbusters is really over. We are getting a lot more specialized. We're trying to come up with new therapies, new mechanisms of actions, and the way that compounds are being created and optimized. And so the idea is that if you look at the scientists who are working tirelessly to find the right molecules, to identify the right targets, it takes up a lot of their time to identify and run a lot of proof of concepts and identify that right target and that right molecule. And the question is, can we take off some of this or a lot of this work off their plates so that they can actually focus on that new breakthrough approach to drug discovery? So generative chemistry is a really good example of the application of AI to shrink the amount of time we spend on R&D and also to optimize the budgets that we spend on R&D. In the last 25 years, the amount of time it takes to bring the medicine to the market has not decreased, it's actually increased, and it's developing a drug became more expensive. So how can we automate a lot of this work that our precious, talented scientists do in the lab in order to optimize this process? The second one is the manufacturing. So if you think about the manufacturing capacity and the ability for pharmaceutical companies to bring the drug that has been approved to the market, largely depends on how fast they can manufacture the drug, how well they can preserve the drug so that it's in the state that where it's under the right temperature, in the right facility, it's shipped to the right place. How can we take advantage of a highly automated supply chain of the likes of Amazon and Walmart in order to ship the product to the patient faster and manufacturing faster? We see a lot of it now happening with the vaccine for COVID-19. It's unprecedented how quickly we're able to partner with different companies, and Novartis is actually one of the companies that partners with one of vaccine manufacturing in order to utilize the manufacturing facilities to bring the drug to the patients. And finally, the commercial. So for the very long time, we've been treating patients as patients as people who go to the doctor in order to treat the disease. Well, we're past that now. We really need to look at our patients as consumers. We're all patients. You're the patient, I'm the patient, we're all patients. We're just not patients all the time. And so, but we expect to be engaged by the pharmaceutical companies the same way as we engage with the technology companies. So how can we get on this new wave of the next generation engagement path where we can interact with our customers and the consumers the same way they interact with the technology companies and the retail?
Yep, that's fantastic, Tatiana. And Jason, where do you think there are opportunities using AI in pharma?
And I completely agree with Tatiana. I think the opportunities are everywhere. I think just in general, we live in a very data-rich industry. We're almost spoiled by how much data we have. Plus, there's just huge value. We're impacting patients' healthcare. We're really like bending the curve of life. So it's extremely valuable. Plus, I also think there's a lot of missteps along the way. There's a lot of inefficiencies. There's a lot of things that could be more effective. And more specifically, I would say two areas that kind of come to mind is one, bringing a drug to market. It could take 10 to 15 years and $1 billion. And more specifically, like the phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, which take several years, tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. There's a lot of inefficiencies there, and they could definitely be expedited using artificial intelligence and machine learning to make sure that you're getting to market sooner. Not only is there huge cost savings, but getting to market sooner means more time on market before loss of exclusivity, which has huge value because the patent clock doesn't start when the FDA gives you approval. It started when you made the molecule. So having an extra year or two of peak sales could easily be hundreds of millions of dollars. And then more importantly, you're impacting more patients by coming to market sooner. And then one other example I was going to give is really identifying rare disease and properly diagnosing patients. I think across every therapeutic area, if you give a proper diagnosis sooner, you improve the patient's health outcome. And rare disease, by definition is rare. So doctors don't see many cases of it. And unfortunately, these rare disease patients can go years, sometimes decades, not getting the proper diagnosis, often getting wrong diagnosis and wrong treatments. So if we could expedite, finding those rare disease and properly diagnosing, we're ultimately helping that health outcome at the end.
All right, and Faisal, just curious, what do you think are the opportunities that you've seen in your work?
Yeah, I echo the thoughts shared. There's virtually no aspect of pharma which is not touched by AI and where AI is not being deployed, right? And we talked about drug discovery, identifying new molecules, simulations in that end. As we move forward, we think about designing trials, phase 1, 2, 3, or beyond, simulating trial outcomes, looking at the right patient target populations. Maybe it's through a companion diagnostic and building that to target patients, and doing that in a multimodality perspective, using imaging data, combining with maybe omics data and clinical data to identify the right patients, to predict responders. The use of wearable and digital devices that can provide continuous monitoring, can help enroll patients, but also can help, for example, to identify the right dose. So if you think about, say, movement disorders, Parkinson's disease, et cetera, oftentimes dose titration is done by physicians where patients note their symptoms in a diary, very inaccurate, and they go to the doctor every 1 or 2 months. Directly monitoring patients on a continuous basis can help tailor the therapy for them. There's also a lot of applications in terms of just looking at operational aspects. So we've been talking about scientific aspects, drug discovery, running the trial, et cetera. But even operationally, trying to find the right sites. How do you enroll patients? How do you predict some of those factors is critical. And we truly believe that AI is not going to replace how drug development is done, right? You still need that insight, that biological human expertise. But the folks who leverage AI, and at this point, the folks who leverage AI will certainly replace those who don't. And at this point, those who don't use AI are just becoming fewer and fewer in number. But then I sit in R&D, and we have a tendency sometimes when we say pharma to think about R&D. But I think, as Tatiana was saying, pharma has other aspects to it, and AI is used throughout that whole chain as well, whether it's in manufacturing and supply chain, whether it's in commercial operations and sales and marketing, and identifying the right populations of patients who might be served by your therapeutic offering. Even in some of the support functions, like say finance or HR, who are starting to use AI-based solutions for their operations. So I truly believe there's no kind of nook or corner of the industry which doesn't have an AI solution that's actively being used, developed, or deployed.
I'm going to go a little bit off scripted because I think you guys have all touched on an interesting point, but are there certain aspects of the drug discovery and development life cycle that you think is being impacted more than others? Is a certain stage accelerating in a rapid pace compared to another area of drug discovery and development?
Yeah, so I can comment on that. I think that in the preclinical stage, so before the preclinical and early stage clinical trials, I think there is a lot of activity happening there in terms of the not just an ability to work with the data. The data in the biomedical research is enormous, and it's been digitized actually even before commercial data or even clinical trial data. It's been around for decades at this point. I think one of the things that we haven't seen before was the power of the compute resources that are now a lot cheaper than they used to be before, that enable data scientists to process this data and run the models much faster at scale. And then the other aspect is, of course, the advancements in neural networks, deep learning, some of the instruments of data science that enable the processing and making sense of data, large data sets, and creating new knowledge and self-learning. So self-learning is a very important part of the drug discovery, because otherwise you're constantly relying on scientists to check the interim results of the data, and therefore you're not necessarily cutting down the time of the scientists and the work that they need to do. I think we see a lot of companies and the startups playing in different spaces, all the way from target identification to the toxicology, pharmacology, to the safety and efficacy optimization. I think one of the things that I'm curious to see is the companies that nail the end-to-end process of the preclinical drug discovery. I personally have not seen a lot of examples of companies actually doing it end-to-end. A lot of them are great at target identification. A lot of them are great at the molecule, finding the right molecules, and looking at the compounds. But seeing those end-to-end, and I think a lot of companies are trying to get there, and probably they will get there soon. But I think that's what pharma companies are interested, or drug discovery teams are interested in, partnering more with the end-to-end providers rather than a bunch of providers who are just working in one of those stages of drug discovery.
Yeah, I'll build on that by saying I don't think there's any one area that's moving faster than the others. You're seeing the penetration of AI across the board. Everyone's eager because for one reason, AI is just such a hot topic outside of pharma, just broadly in life, right? Self-driving cars, Amazon shipping you what you need, Netflix suggesting the next movie to watch, et cetera, et cetera. The list is endless. So a lot of people are seeing opportunities, and everyone's moving at pace. I think where you see some of the calibration around pace, though, is where there is perhaps a need to exercise more rigor. We want to use good AI practices across the board. In some of the cases, particularly where there's an impact on people's lives and on the scientific side, you want to make sure you're being extra careful. You're, say, using validation sets properly. You're thinking about the intended use of a model. And in some of those cases, even further, there may be regulatory applications to consider. And so that can help, I wouldn't say slow the pace down, but it causes you to be more thoughtful about the work you're doing. Whereas in some other cases, perhaps you can move a little bit faster. If the commercial team is using an AI-based solution in their marketing efforts, they can perhaps afford a little bit more flexibility there. So I'd say adoption is happening at pace across the board, but some of the different types of applications necessitate a little bit more thought and care in the deployment and rollout of the AI-based solution.
And the one thing that I'll add, just because at Analytical Wizards, we've seen across a few clients, we've seen a lot more kind of exploratory in the expediting of phase 3 clinical trials. For people who worked on the commercial side, they're probably very familiar with the IMS open medical claims data or the Symphony open medical claims data. Those were the two largest medical claims open providers. They were both acquired by large CROs or clinical research organizations. So Quintiles with IMS made IQVIA, and I think it was PRA purchased Symphony. But we're seeing clients kind of branch out and explore other data assets like around Healthverity or LexisNexis or CareSet. And I think the more people are realizing that the data they have in-house is great, but there's a lot more data that you can leverage, and no one data asset's perfect. So the more you're able to combine different data assets, even at Analytical Wizards, we're an analytical company, but we're very quick to admit better data trumps better analytics. So the more you can go out there and get the best data, and seeing clients actually do that is kind of great to see.
Jason, I think that's actually a wonderful point, right? There is AI comes with multiple aspects to it. One is data, and one then is the algorithms you use. And I completely agree with you. Better data often trumps better algorithms. And the build that I'll have on your point is you're also seeing pharma companies in some cases acquire data assets, right? That was one of the drivers behind, for instance, Roche acquiring Flatiron. So you're seeing those types of initiatives as well.
So I'm curious, and we'll wrap up this topic around opportunities. One more follow-up is, a lot of us have internal development opportunities where our own internal teams are working on AI solutions. And then if you look at the questions, a lot of questions are coming in. How do you engage with startup companies? How do you evaluate startup companies to pair them up with the opportunities that you've identified internally? So how do you think about that internal development versus partnering with somebody? And then when you do partner with somebody, what are the things that you look for in a partner? I think what some of the questions have been around what startups are exciting. We don't necessarily have to name the startups themselves, but just what do you think about when you partner with somebody, and what are you looking for?
Sure, and I can go first because I think it'll be fairly quick. But at Analytical Wizards, we have a lot of partnerships with data vendor companies, just because, for us to be Analytical Wizards, we almost have to be data wizards, and we have to understand the data. And having those close relationships with the data vendors just empowers our team. And our team does a lot of training too on just, what are the caveats of the data? What's the new upcoming data sources coming? And then just share best practices and kind of learnings that we've come across.
I think from the internal, I want to build actually on Jason's point. The need for end-to-end solutions is very important. It's very high for the business in general. And I think what's important to realize is what are capabilities that you recognize honestly you don't have currently in your organization versus the opportunities that it could be a quick win to develop and grow within your organization. So I'll give you an example. For example, there is a growing need for R&D teams to synthesize their clinical trials data because there's just too much. When you partner with the third parties, there is a lot of the times you don't need an actual clinical trial data, the numbers. You can all you're looking for is depending on the use case. Let's say virtualization of clinical trials or virtual recruitment of patients. You just need to validate the approach with a partner before you start industrializing or building a huge enterprise solution. So the question becomes, how do you share the data with these third parties? And clinical trial data is super sensitive for a lot of life sciences. And so, the synthesis of the data became very important recently. And when we're looking we're looking inside and we're trying to figure out, okay, do we have experts on synthetic data sets? Oftentimes we realize that we have subject matter experts, but we just don't have enough muscle in the organization to spend on synthesizing the data. But if you're looking outside, you can see that there are companies out there that spend 5, 7, 10 years on different synthesis techniques. This is just an example. And when you ask yourself, do you really want to spend the same amount of time developing it internally? And is it a strategic priority for you? Important enough to spend and invest in that capability, and sometimes you don't. So in this case, for example, there are some companies I'm aware that decided that it is a strategic opportunity that is worth investing in, and some just don't, and they focus on something else. I think what's really important for the data scientist and data science strategy for the company is to come up with a very clear roadmap, the must wins. The company has to win in data science in order to make progress on the top line and bottom line, and ultimately bring value to the patients. And be very rigorous about where do you invest internally. Because if you're spreading yourselves too thin and you're trying to just create capabilities internally everywhere, then you're not really experts. And this is where the partnership could be more valuable. The last thing I'm just going to say is that at Novartis, we just recently rolled out a platform. It's not external yet. It's about to come external. It's a platform, the benchmarking platform for AI and ML vendors, but also for internal capabilities. So we run these challenges with our potential partners who can participate in those challenges, just like you would participate in a hackathon. But also the internal data science teams within Novartis could take advantage of participation. And at the end, we have a panel who would review the solutions and figure out, okay, so is this something we can actually pull off internally, or is there someone else externally that we should partner with?
I'd say that that's a great question. First of all, I think collaboration and partnerships are exactly the way to go. Everybody collaborates. I don't think any one institution or company has a monopoly on smart people, right? There are smart people solving problems better than us in many areas. But I've been on both sides of that table. I've spent a chunk of my career in startups, and now I'm at AstraZeneca, which is a large multinational company. You know, in the startup world, it's a very different type of environment. Depending on how mature you are, you might have a product that's ready and you're trying to go out and find, business opportunities, and you have a sales team, et cetera. You might be much earlier phase and you have a vague idea of a product offering, but you're trying to find that first hook into a customer saying, just let me come help you. I'll do a pilot. I'll do it for free. And then you say, because then they'll help me shape things, and then I'll work on your problem, and that will help me develop my product. So I'm happy to operate at risk. So that's the mentality. When you're a startup, you're very hungry, you're looking to prove yourself, and you're just trying to get your foot in the door, right? Oftentimes cold calling and just getting out there. That's how you develop a business. And I've had that mindset, and I've been in that space. But then if you're on the flip side, you're now at a large company looking to partner with a startup. Guess what? I'm sure all of us have 5 different startups every week reaching out to us, all saying the same thing, all saying, hey, I've got something, it might not be related. Do you have this problem? Do you have a problem running models at scale, tracking models? Do you have a problem finding algorithms, using deep learning, et cetera, et cetera? Or just let us do something with you at risk. Well, if you're the 10th different company who's spoken to me that month about doing something at risk, and guess what? I've got my own challenges and stuff to stay busy with. It's hard to get your foot in the door. So what I've learned and what I advise startups is be very good at one thing. And not everybody is going to perhaps need that one thing, but those who do will then jump on it, right? That's how the startups who I've chosen to work with in my career are the ones who were very good at that one thing that, again, they were the smart people, and we don't have a monopoly on smart people. We needed that expertise, and they'd already solved it. So why reinvent the wheel? I'm a very lazy guy. I don't want to reinvent the wheel. But that's the value proposition, right? Someone who's solved the problem that I want to solve or need to have solved that I can bring in and have them do it for me. So I'd say that's really the parties at the two ends of the table think about things differently. If you're a larger company, you're trying to say, how will this solve my problems? How will this make my life easier? Why would I go externally versus using my internal teams to build and develop this? And if I'm going externally, why would I go with that startup versus another one? So then when you're the startup, you have to think about that's your customer and you're trying to solve your customer's problems. How do you become really good at that one thing? So that's just a perspective from someone who's been on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's shift gears a little bit. We talked a lot about the opportunities. Patrika, if you can pull up this slide real quick. Yep. So I think all of us developing opportunities in this space, we all have battle scars, right? And kind of know some of the challenges that have been associated with developing these AI solutions. So what challenges do you encounter when you're developing these solutions in pharma? So Jace, maybe we'll start with you on this one.
Sure. And I would say one of the biggest ones is just organizational understanding. And maybe they're jaded from previous experiences. They have their own battle scars from someone who came in with some black box solution that gave something that made no sense. And I would say, especially on the commercial side, I've seen AI projects go wrong where you're telling a very large sales force to do something that really doesn't make sense to them and it's not transparent. So I think a lot of the challenges is just that organizational understanding, which means I think more of our teams and our skill sets is we have to be better at being storytellers as well as be as transparent and simplify things as much as possible.
I think Faisal, I'm curious to get your perspective on this, right? You've seen it from the startup side, now you've seen it from AstraZeneca's side. What are you seeing as some of the challenges, I guess, of, you've already kind of mentioned working with the startup companies themselves, but in terms of developing an actual solution, what were kind of some of the battle scars that you experienced?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You know, I'd say it's keeping in mind why you're doing something. There's a very big difference between doing something as a proof of concept, maybe doing something for a scientific perspective. I'm going to get the publication out of it. That's the end goal, versus trying to get a product at scale. And there's very many different motivators, right? If you look across that pipeline, if you're doing something very short term, I might do something in, say, using Python and really not worry as much about documentation and get something done to get that paper out and we're done. If you're building something at scale, you might want to use a different, totally many other tools and capabilities. You might be using a simpler algorithm, right? If the goal isn't a publication, but a product, maybe a random forest will do the job instead of the world's greatest, most complex deep learning network. You want to be tracking drift of models and performance. You want to be making sure that you've got a dedicated hypercare focus. I'd say intended use really ties in with the scale, the structure, the complexity of the work that you're doing. And it also ties in with maybe just to hook in one of the questions in the Q&A here about ROI, right? I always touch on what is the impact? Why are we using AI here? And what is the value of perhaps not using AI? I think AI has applications everywhere, like I said earlier, but you should be able to say, this is the additional build. This is why using an AI-based exploratory approach or a product here in a solution will help us accelerate something to whatever benefit and return. So it's a very different transition, and I've been part of in my startup life where we've had to make that transition, right? So it's very different developing something, prototyping it, then running at scale and monitoring it in your data. So maybe I'll end on this example. A few hundred or few thousand samples from a handful of instances, algorithm or prediction model, some kind, whatever. But now you want to apply it worldwide, right? And so demographics are different. Diseases are treated differently across the world. If you're working with biosamples, they're stored differently in different areas. The transport medium may be different. Let's take imaging. Calibration software for the imaging cameras changes over time, and all of that introduces variations and variants into your models that you have to handle. So it's challenging, and the only way to kind of bridge that is to be thoughtful and careful at each step of that process and use best scientific rigor.
Great. And Tatiana, what do you think? What are some of the challenges? And some of the questions that have been coming in, I'll open it up to the rest of the panel as well, but some of the questions that are coming in are really around the data and how it's cleaned and what are the challenges around the data itself. So if you guys can also talk about that and maybe some of the opportunities that we'll have for cleaning up the data, making it a better quality data set. But Tatiana, would love to kind of hear your thoughts on the challenges first.
Sure. I'll talk about both just very quickly. I think both Faisal and Jason touched on most of the challenges. I'll just say that the pace of true innovation is not fast. But when we're trying to make a tangible business impact across the organization, we need to demonstrate the real value to the business quickly. And so a lot of the time, so we're talking about startups, right? So a big part of my job is to make business cases for AI opportunities within to the senior stakeholders and then assemble to deliver on them. And a lot of the times I find myself to justify and quantify the opportunity either in terms of dollars or in terms of patients' life. And so I think what's really important is to manage the business expectation that if you really want a big breakthrough AI opportunity, it's not going to happen overnight. And But at the same time, you can't. You also cannot just say that, hey, give me 2 years, I'm going to come back to you and give you this unicorn. It's not going to happen either. So you have to strike and walk that tightrope between consistently and iteratively demonstrating impact, yet managing expectations that this is worth investing. If we're not committed and we don't have a conviction that this is the path we're going towards, then we're always going to flip-flop between small investments in small things and then never do any one of them right. And in terms of the data, the cleaning, the fixing, I think linking and fixing data is at utmost priority for the organization. People like to talk about one big data lake of the company. I'm a believer, and Faisal and Jason, please jump at me if you disagree. I'm actually curious, but I'm of a belief that one size fits all type data lake, an MDM solution, it doesn't work. It doesn't exist. And so what's important is the underlying technology to be common. So if you can have a very big, the foundational layer of your data lakes to be common, then the transfer of the data between data lakes becomes more seamless. So I'll give you an example. We have commercial teams. Let's say different franchises may have different data lakes, and it's perfectly fine to have a different data lake for large condition diseases versus oncology, for example, because the nature of the diseases is very different. The same way is it makes perfect sense to have different databases or different data lakes for the drug discovery data versus clinical trial. That's also perfectly fine. Sometimes you actually are not even allowed to keep the data in the same place, like for example with patient services. But it's important to understand that even though the data lakes might be different, obviously the data has to follow fair standards and has to be verified, but also it needs to be interconnected, or interconnectable, right? So you don't always need to have everything just kind of like dumped into one place, but having an ability for data scientists to establish connections in the form of API calls, for example, is critical for data to be useful. As far as cleaning the data and linking the data, that's important. That's very important. Although we need to realize that the data will never be 100% clean, and we need to, depending on the use cases, we just need to continue iterating on the data quality and data management as we build more and more use cases.
Great. So let's jump into the next topic here, and then I'll leave some time at the end for questions from the audience as well. So feel free to type in any questions that you guys have as we go through this next topic. So looking at COVID, huge kind of top of mind for all of us here, right? And everyone in the audience as well, I'm sure. How was AI involved in your response? And anyone can get started. Yeah, go for it, Jason.
Sure, I'll start because we see across a couple different clients, and I think COVID has changed a lot of things in every area. But I think definitely from the commercial side, obviously the sales reps weren't going in to see doctors, which completely changed kind of the promotional mix. Now, clients that already had kind of a promotion, omni-channel or a marketing mix platform kind of in place, they were, I think, better equipped to kind of do those what if scenario analyses, like what if the field can't go see a doctor in the next 6 months? How do we re-optimize our promotional channels? How does this kind of change going forward? And then also, I would say another kind of big impact that we saw was in clinical trials. Now, we have some clients that had a COVID-related therapy, so either a COVID vaccine or some type of treatment that helps COVID patients once they have COVID. And a lot of those clients felt like they were kind of chasing COVID and like after the fact. As I think everyone remembers, New York City was one of the worst kind of outbreaks at the very beginning, like earlier in the year. But by the summer, New York City kind of had COVID under control, and we saw outbreaks in like the South and West Coast. But if you looked in the summer, most of the clinical trials in COVID were in New York City. And I think a lot of our clients felt like they were kind of, after the fact, jumping And obviously, if you're testing a COVID vaccine, if you give 10 patients the vaccine and 10 patients a placebo, if no one gets COVID, then you're not really testing anything. And also, you need the COVID patients to test the therapy. So it was important for them to understand where is the next COVID outbreak going to be. And we actually published a white paper on that where we were predicting COVID outbreak. But then on the flip side too, I mean, recruiting for clinical trials is already very difficult, and COVID just threw another wrench into it. So our clients that had non-COVID related therapies, they were actually trying to avoid these areas because they felt that a lot of the patients, were less likely to sign up for a clinical trial if that meant they had to go to a hospital where possibly other COVID patients were going to be. So it was kind of, both ways. But I think most importantly, the clients kind of had to adapt. And COVID was so rapidly changing. So, having platforms in place definitely kind of helps them kind of re-steer their resources in the right place.
Yeah, I'd add, I think you've seen the value of AI-based approaches throughout in any aspect, whether it's, as Jason was saying, even non-COVID related diseases, maybe trying to look at patient recruitment, et cetera. I think you've seen the impact in detecting COVID, modeling COVID, the epidemiological factors, diagnosis, maybe chest x-rays, molecular assays to diagnose, et cetera, those types of things. Looking at repositioning of assets and assets to treat the disease or develop new treatments, et cetera. So I'd say COVID has touched all aspects of our lives. And since AI touches all aspects of our lives, there's been connections throughout. The list of examples is almost too numerous to list, I'd say.
Tatiana, any COVID examples, or should we move on to the next topic as well?
It's a lot of what Jason said, actually. We saw a lot of the marketing shifts and clinical trials. So I'll just skip this question to leave more time for the Q&A.
No problem. So let's do one more question and we'll jump into the Q&A. So next 5 years, where do you see this space going? Where do you see kind of your roles headed? And then as you build out teams to address the opportunities in this space, what are you looking for in the skill sets that are on these teams, who you bring in, et cetera? So anyone that wants to take this one, jump in and go first.
I can start. So there is, in my mind, there are two big must-wins for us as an industry to, if we really achieve those two things, then we can be successful with the next 5 years. The first one is to really industrialize AI. I think we've demonstrated as individual companies, industries, that AI is powerful. It has a large use, and it can really accelerate the pace of business. But the industrialization and scaling of AI is still is a challenge for a lot of the teams, due to data availability, to infrastructure, due to various organizational silos, and so on. But really, scaling AI is what is going to move, in my opinion, move the needle on, making progress in cutting costs of the R&D, in bringing the medicines faster to market, in engaging with our customers and consumers in a very different way, not one size fits all kind of communication, but actually personalization, and getting to really provide care to the patient beyond the pill or beyond the injection, and having a 360 view of our customer and the consumer. And I think that so industrialization of AI is important. And the second one is, in my mind, building the top talent. If you ask any data scientist who is a top data scientist coming out of school or coming out of a prestigious or valuable data science program, computer engineers, and so on, really, top of the or cream of the crop. If you ask them where they want to work, pharma is not their top choice. Any pharma company is not their top choice. It's really tech companies. And it's not because of compensation, because of the culture. it's just because pharma is just not, in their eyes, is just not advanced enough when it comes to data science and when it comes to technology, and just mindset and appreciation for data science as the tech companies do. And so I think it's important to change that and really change the mindset of the internal organization within ourselves, within our teams, that we really need to fight for the best AI and data science talent, and we really need to position ourselves as the attractive employer. And in order to do that, we need to have basics done. So automation of the reporting, the QA of the data, automation of a lot of basic things that take away so much time from data scientists away from doing the stuff that's really fun and exciting. And I think doing that basic cleaning and I'm saying the word basic, it's not basic, it's very complex, but it's foundational. We need to build those foundational layers of technology and analytics in order to free up data scientists to do the work that they actually find valuable.
Yeah, I completely agree on the talent challenge, right? The new grads that want to join the next FANG, as it was. But on the flip side, I think that's a challenge of awareness, and that's changing. Like we've been talking about the fact there's no aspect of pharma where AI is not playing a role. And so there's some really interesting, intellectually challenging problems. And as people learn about them, honestly, I think we have a better value proposition. For many folks, once they learn, they'd rather spend their time working with the coolest technology, building the latest algorithms to help treat people, help improve people's lives, solve the biggest healthcare challenges, cure diseases, than in some cases, some of the other challenges that you may have in developing a solution to, say, drive social media ads or whatever else, right? So sometimes I think our value proposition is very compelling, and it's around how do we just make people aware and bring the talent in. And I think the important thing here is how do we develop diverse, comprehensive, multi-talented teams, right? Our industry and our industry has its own sets of challenges. When you're working with biomedical data, perhaps in a regulated context, you have different practices. So you need to know the lingo. You need to diseases and their ontologies and the progression. It sometimes takes years to learn that. But on the other hand, there's a lot of creativity. There's a lot of raw energy in folks who perhaps don't know all that, but know the AI side of the house. So how do you build multidisciplinary teams which bring that together? And so you can leverage the wins in both areas. And the other challenge that I've seen is that you see a lot of early career talent. AI in general has become so hot in the last 5 to 10 years. You're seeing early career talent. But if you're looking for leaders, sometimes that's a little bit more challenging. If you're looking for somebody with 20, 25 years of experience to lead large initiatives or large teams, it was a smaller pool when they started in their career 20, 25 years ago. So I almost see a flip side of the challenge there where there's less available talent. And how do you find them and bring them in and help them grow in their career versus early career talent where it's more about exposure and helping them grow and learn in their journey?
Yeah. And I'll just add, I agree with, both the panelists. It's a shame that, pharma and healthcare is not seen as a sexier location than in Amazon, where you can save a couple cents on a roll of paper towels versus bending, the curve of life for patients. And just on, recruiting talent, we look for that ninja pirate storyteller. So the ninja, I think, is right out of school. They're very resourceful, can get any data, can use any type of model. The pirate, though, that's where we put the business acumen, and they're really kind of hunger to find that next value. And then storyteller, it's self-explanatory, but probably one of the biggest things, and it's also where I see AI going in the next 5 years. It's more not only making it scalable, but also user-friendly, transparent, and people basically want to use it. We don't want AI to be seen as the face of, HAL from 2001 Space Odyssey, where the computer basically takes over and destroys the spaceship. We want it to be more like Baymax from Hero 6. And if you haven't seen that Disney movie, it's a great movie. I highly recommend it. But Baymax is this nurse robot that looks like a big marshmallow because it's very huggable. But we need to be more like Baymax and less like HAL.
I love that. I'm going to steal that quote if you don't mind.
Please do.
Great. We have 7 minutes left. Patrika, I think you wanted to take over from here, right?
Yeah, so we have quite a few questions that have come in from the audience, so we want to go ahead and take advantage of those. So I'll start with the first question. We have someone asked, do you have any successful examples of converging AI and RPA in your organizations?
Yeah, I'd say we've been talking about that, right? A lot of the examples we've shared cover that. RPA, perhaps for those who don't know, is robotic process automation. You're seeing that just naturally happen in many industries. And in pharma especially, they go hand in hand. So some of the things that we've been talking about, such as say trial operations or other things, you're seeing RPA go hand in hand with AI-based solutions to help facilitate research or marketing or reaching out to customers across the value chain as we've been discussing.
That makes sense. And then we also, I know we did talk about the preclinical stage, but someone asked, how is AI impacting drug discovery at the preclinical stage? And what startup companies do you think are doing a great job in this area? Anyone have anything there?
So I think we covered, right, some of this, and I'm not personally comfortable saying the names of the companies that we partner with. I don't know about my colleagues, but what's important is to understand what it is that you strategically want to develop internally versus you want to create the partnership with, and strike the balance between in these collaborations. And sometimes pharmaceutical companies create joint ventures with startups. Sometimes they acquire them for their capabilities. And just like Faisal said before, try to find the part of the value chain that you're really good at, because that's what makes you an expert.
The other thing that I'll add is I think the pharma industry as a whole doesn't have a challenge at the beginning of the funnel, right? The discovery piece. There's some stats out there of how to get one successful phase 3 trial done. How many assets did you start with? The beginning of the funnel can use more input, but it's pretty wide. So I sometimes hear people talk about, when will we see the first AI discovered molecule, right? When will that come out? And don't get me wrong, that would be awesome to see. But instead, I think it's more so, how do we help leverage AI to reduce the dropout as you go from target lead ID and optimization through phase 1, 2, 3 studies, right? How do you use AI to identify molecules which may be more effective, which will have less side effects, et cetera? That's where I think there's real key value. So just a personal opinion, and I've done work on the early discovery side of things too, and there's a lot of opportunity there, but there's a lot more dropout, and I see a higher value proposition there. But we see aspects of AI throughout that, and we're doing that, startups are doing that, et cetera. It's a very rich ecosystem.
Awesome. Thank you. So we'll jump into the next question from Rohit. He says, we have a challenge from one of our pharma clients for measuring 10x ROI on the AI use cases. Could you please share some thoughts on the metrics in which could be used or you're using to select and prioritize projects?
My first question is, why 10x? What other technology are people demanding has to be 10x, right? I think this goes back to why are you using AI? Let's be thoughtful. If there's a lot of companies that fall into the trap of, we'll throw everything into this sexy AI magic black box and 10x value proposition will come out. That's just not going to work, right? It's more so, where are we intelligent? What is the intended use? What is the problem we're trying to solve? Just my thought.
No, and I agree. And I know Tatiana talked about this earlier, but it's finding those little quick wins that are actually implementable. So for example, we have an offering called Compliance Optimizer. And if the compliance team or the patient services team was getting success 1 out of 10 times, and now that's increased to 3 out of 10 times, that's a huge win in success. And you just got to measure those little kind of, what is your objective? Measure those incremental wins along the way, and then make sure that you're also promoting and kind of telling that story that, hey, we were able to save this many patients from staying on therapy, and let that be your new 10x.
Completely agree. I think for me, when I think about 10x, I kind of roll my eyes. But when I think about incremental wins and then scaling those incremental wins alone in pharma is always a huge kind of impact that you're making across the organization and the industry. And so we really focus on let's get those incremental wins, and then just even implementing those incremental wins can give you that scale that could return that value that you're looking for. And then ultimately over time, you compound upon it by building on top of those incremental wins.
Great insights there. Thank you. And then we'll jump to, I think, what's probably going to be our last question. The question is, do you think we will ever get to the paint color model with pharmaceuticals? When I buy paint, they have a base and a gallon in gallon cans, poke a hole in the can, add the color variants, and basically there's the color that you wanted. So do you think we'll ever have a base treatment that can be manufactured to become specific to a patient based on the diagnosis?
I saw that question coming in, and I love that question. That's ultimately the goal eventually, right? And I think you're seeing some areas where we're doing this today with AI. Dosing is a great example of that. It's not necessarily changing the treatment, but just changing the quantity, right? The dosing of the medication that you're providing per patient. If you look at the mRNA platform that the COVID vaccines are being developed on, that to me is exciting because now we can rapidly iterate based on the new variants coming out. But are we there yet to the paint can model? I'm not exactly sure. It'd be really exciting to get there one day, but there are a lot of complications there with segmenting patients and patient populations and targeting specific people. So I'd love to get to that model one day. It's something that I've always been thinking about, but how we get there, it's going to be difficult for sure.
Yeah, I would say maybe our great-great-grandchildren have a chance of this paint can model. But I know like there is personalized medicine at Novartis. They have a CAR T therapy where they take the white blood cells out of the patient. It's not as easy as poking a hole in a can. I think a team of, I don't know how many biomedical engineers have to rearrange the white blood cells. And then, several weeks later, they're able to put it back into the patient for that one patient. So I think we're, on the right track, but we'll have to see, how simplified it gets.
I'll maybe
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that we're also getting smarter about patients and their makeup. So if you look at the companies like 23andMe and other gene collection companies, they just learn more, and you are able to identify the targets more easily as you collecting more data on the patients themselves.
I'll just maybe stretch the analogy and say, I think, we're all unique. And so it's maybe more the interior designer model where everyone has their own preferences. Pharma has moved beyond, just take an aspirin. It works for everybody. What we're learning is everyone is unique. They have their own genetic profile, lifestyle circumstances, et cetera, that affect many diseases. So I'd almost argue we're getting better at personalizing that and treating the individual rather than mass treatment. And that's kind of where I see things going.
Awesome. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but this has been a wonderful discussion. And I'd like to say thank you to all of our panelists and a special thank you to Sandeep for moderating today. So I know the audience is giving you a huge virtual round of applause. All right, thank you everyone. So please stay in touch with AI4 to see what we have coming up next. And again, thank you all for joining us today. Thanks again and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.